Imagine waking up with no alarm, no commute, no boss, no inbox, no shift to clock into. For 99% of human history, this wasn't a fantasy. It was just Tuesday. There was no such thing as a job, no paycheck, no career, no 9 to 5. And yet, every single person in that world woke up and had a full day ahead of them. So, what did they actually do with it? The answer isn't nothing, it's the opposite. And it completely rewrites what we think work even is. Let's kill the biggest myth first, that life before jobs meant a desperate, non-stop scramble for survival. In the 1960s, anthropologist Richard Lee spent months living with and timing the Jew/hoansi Bushmen of the Kalahari Desert, one of the last groups on Earth still living close to the ancient foraging lifestyle. He tracked exactly how many hours adults spent finding food. The numbers stunned everyone. Somewhere between 15 and 20 hours a week. Even when you add cooking and food processing on top, total work time barely crossed the low 40s, and that's still less than many people spend on a modern job plus housework combined. Anthropologist Marshall Sahlins looked at this data and coined a phrase that flipped the entire field on its head: the original affluent society. Not affluent because they had more. Affluent because they needed less and got it fast. So, if hunting and gathering only took 3 to 5 hours a day, what filled the rest? This is where it gets interesting, because the answer isn't leisure the way you picture it. It wasn't scrolling a phone on a couch. It was an entire second economy of tasks that never show up in a job description, but were absolutely essential to staying alive. Start with tools. A stone axe doesn't last forever. An arrow shaft splits. A digging stick wears down. Someone in the group was constantly repairing, sharpening, and remaking equipment. And this wasn't a side hustle, it was survival infrastructure. Archaeological sites are packed with flaking debris, the tiny stone chips left behind from hours of tool-making, concentrated in specific spots where someone clearly sat and worked for a long stretch of time. This is the ancient version of maintenance work, except your life depended on the maintenance actually getting done. Then, there was food processing, which was its own full job. Meat had to be smoked or dried to keep it from spoiling. Nuts had to be cracked. Tubers had to be dug, cleaned, sometimes soaked for hours to remove toxins. Hides had to be scraped, stretched, and cured into something you could actually wear or sleep on. None of this was quick. Processing a single animal hide by hand could take an entire day of steady, repetitive labor. There was no refrigerator, no store, no shortcut. Every calorie and every piece of clothing had to be earned twice, once by finding it, and again by turning it into something usable. Childcare filled enormous stretches of the day too, but not the way you might think. In most foraging societies, children weren't isolated in a nursery. They were folded directly into the group's activity. Toddlers rode on hips while adults gathered plants. Slightly older kids tagged along on foraging trips and picked up real skills just by watching and copying. Anthropologists who've studied groups like the Hadza in Tanzania have found that by around age 6 or 7, children are already contributing real, useful food to the group. There was no separate category called school. Learning and working and living were the same activity happening at the same time. And then there was the part that almost never gets mentioned: doing nothing on purpose. Not idle boredom, but deliberate rest. Multiple time-use studies on modern foraging groups, from the Kalahari to the Philippines, consistently find huge blocks of the day spent resting, grooming each other, napping, and simply sitting together and talking. This wasn't laziness. Rest after exertion is metabolically necessary, and a group that overworked itself in the wild burned calories it couldn't easily replace. Doing nothing was, in its own strange way, a survival skill, which brings us to what might be the single most important activity of the entire day: talking. In 2014, anthropologist Wiessner published a landmark study comparing daytime and nighttime conversation among the Jew hoansi. During the day, most conversation was practical: complaints, logistics, who's going where. But once the fire was lit at night, everything changed. The overwhelming majority of conversation shifted to stories, myths, jokes, and social gossip about people who weren't even there. This wasn't wasted time. It was how reputations were built, how alliances were formed, and how a group without written records passed down everything it knew, from which plants were poisonous to how to survive a drought to the next generation. Even social conflict had its own daily rhythm and its own labor. Disputes over food sharing, mates, or perceived slights had to be talked through again and again, because there was no police force, no court, no manager to escalate a complaint to. The group itself was the entire system of law, and maintaining it took real, ongoing social effort. Anthropologists sometimes call this social work in the most literal sense, the unpaid, unglamorous labor of just keeping a group of people functioning together peacefully. Now here's the twist that flips the whole modern narrative upside down. When agriculture showed up roughly 10 to 12,000 years ago, we tend to assume life got easier. It didn't. Skeletal remains from early farming communities show shorter stature, worse teeth, and more signs of chronic disease than the foragers who came before them. Farming tied people to a fixed patch of land, forced them to work it constantly, and made their diet far less varied. The invention of agriculture didn't reduce the workday. Multiple long-run studies estimate that farmers in comparable environments today put in noticeably more hours than nearby foraging groups, sometimes close to 50% more. In a very real sense, the first job was also the first time humans worked harder for less. So what did people do all day before jobs existed? They hunted and gathered for a few hours, and stopped once there was enough, because there was no incentive to stockpile more than the group could carry or eat. They spent the rest of the day fixing tools, processing food, curing hides, teaching children by simply living beside them, resting deliberately, and talking around a fire until the stories became the culture itself. There was no separation between work and life, because there was no job pulling you away from one to do the other. The entire day was just living, and living was the task. We often think of the invention of the job as progress, the moment humans finally organized their time. But for most of our history, time wasn't something you organized around a job. It was something you filled with exactly what needed doing, and nothing more. And maybe that's the real difference between then and now. They stopped working once they had enough. We rarely do.